I never imagined that at 71, I'd be fighting for the very soul of my neighbourhood. This morning, as I deadheaded my prized roses in the garden Eli and I had tended for 43 years, I heard Rebecca Everstone on her phone again, her voice sharp as winter wind cutting through my hedgerow. "That old woman's garden is an eyesore," she was saying. "Those trees are probably diseased. And don't get me started on that compost smell. I'd been listening to complaints like this for months now, ever since the Everstones moved into the Morrison place next door. What they didn't know, what nobody in Bellwood Glen knew, was that buried in the deed to their property was a clause my grandfather had written in 1923, a covenant that gave our family veto power over any major changes to the surrounding land. But would I finally have the courage to use it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Brighton, but most folks have called me Ellie. Since I was 12 years old and first moved to this house with my grandfather after my parents died in that terrible car accident outside Boston. That was 1966, and Bellwood Glen was a different place then, quieter, more respectful, where neighbours knew each other's middle names and borrowed sugar without keeping count. The house itself tells the story of my family better than I ever could. It's a rambling colonial built in 1887 by my great-grandfather, with wide plank floors that creak in familiar places and windows that frame the Connecticut River like paintings. The wraparound porch still holds the swing where Eli proposed to Emmy in 1972, though the cushions have been replaced 3 times since then. The kitchen windows look out over what was once just a vegetable patch, but has grown into 3 acres of carefully tended gardens, roses, herbs, vegetables, and fruit trees that I know as intimately as the lines on my own hands. Eli used to say that gardens don't lie. Plants tell you exactly what they need, when they need it, and they reward honest care with honest beauty. He'd been gone 6 years now, taken by a heart attack, while we were planting bulbs for what would have been our 44th spring together. I still talk to him sometimes, especially when I was working in the soil he'd helped enrich with decades of compost and love. The garden had become my sanctuary and my purpose. Every Saturday morning, 8 women from town would arrive for my informal gardening classes. We'd start with coffee and homemade muffins in the kitchen, then spend 2 hours working with our hands in the earth, sharing stories and wisdom along with planting techniques. These women ranging from Martha Hemley, who was approaching 80, to young Sarah Chen, who just bought her first house, had become my chosen family. Through them, I'd found a way to honour Eli's memory while creating something new and meaningful. That all changed 6 months ago when Rebecca and Chad Everstone bought the Morrison place next door. The Morrisons had been quiet neighbours for 23 years, content away from their driveway, and chat briefly over the garden fence about weather and local news. When they retired and moved to Florida, I'd hoped the new owners would be similarly peaceful. I should have known better when I saw the moving trucks. Everything was white and chrome and aggressively modern furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a home. Rebecca emerged from a gleaming black SUV, wearing yoga pants that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and immediately began surveying the property with the calculating gaze of someone who saw potential rather than charm. The complaints started within a week. My compost bins, which had been in the same spot for 30 years, suddenly violated some aesthetic standard I'd never heard of. The oak tree that shaded both our properties was too large and potentially dangerous. My garden classes brought excessive traffic to the neighbourhood. Even my roses, which had won local garden club awards for 15 consecutive years, were apparently too fragrant and attracted too many bees. Each complaint arrived in my mailbox as a formal letter, printed on expensive stationery with the Everstone address embossed at the top. Rebecca had clearly researched local regulations, because she cited obscure municipal codes and homeowner association guidelines that I didn't even know existed. The letters were always perfectly polite on the surface, filled with phrases like, "I'm sure you understand, and in the interest of neighborhood harmony," but the underlying message was clear. I was old, my property was old, and we were both inconvenient obstacles to their vision of modern suburban perfection. Chad was less diplomatic than his wife, but perhaps more honest in his dismissiveness. I'd catch him looking over at my property with the expression of someone calculating square footage and resale value. He worked in finance, something involving real estate investment, and I suspected he saw our entire neighborhood as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in early October. I was teaching my regular garden class, showing the women how to prepare their flower beds for winter, when Rebecca marched across her perfectly manicured lawn and right up to our group. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed. "This weekly gathering is creating parking issues and disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. I've looked into the local regulations, and I believe you're operating an unauthorized business on residential property." The women in my class looked stunned. Sarah Chen, who was holding a handful of bulbs we'd been discussing, seemed frozen in place. Martha Henley, bless her, stepped forward with the same energy she'd once used to chair the town library board for 30 years. "Rebecca," Martha said, her voice carefully controlled, "Ellie has been sharing her gardening knowledge with friends for over a decade. This is hardly a business transaction." Nevertheless, Rebecca continued, "The increased traffic is problematic, and frankly, the state of this property is beginning to affect neighboring property values. I've been patient, but I think it's time for some updates to bring things into the 21st century." That was the moment I felt something shift inside me. For 6 months, I'd absorbed these complaints with the same patient endurance I'd learned from 43 years of marriage and 71 years of life. I'd even begun to second-guess myself, wondering if my property really was an eyesore, if my quiet way of life was somehow selfish or outdated. But standing there, watching this young woman dismiss decades of careful cultivation as problematic, listening to her reduce my home and my friends to traffic patterns and property values, I felt a familiar stirring that I hadn't experienced since Eli's death. It was the same feeling I'd had as a young urban planner when developers wanted to tear down historic buildings for parking lots, the same protective instinct that had made me fight for green spaces and community gardens in the city. The difference was that this time it was personal. After Rebecca returned to her house and my garden class ended earlier than usual, I sat alone on the porch swing and really looked at my property through objective eyes. The gardens were immaculate, every plant healthy, every pathway swept, every structure maintained with the care of someone who understood that preservation required constant attention. The house itself was solid and beautiful, its white clapboard siding and green shutters a perfect example of New England architectural tradition. Far from being an eyesore, my property was a haven of natural beauty in a neighborhood that was slowly being modernized into uniformity. That evening, I called my oldest friend, Marta Delgado, who'd retired from her law practice 3 years earlier, but still maintained the sharp mind that had made her a formidable civil rights attorney. Marta had been encouraging me for months to push back against the Everstones' complaints, but I'd resisted, preferring to avoid conflict. "They want me to update my property to 21st century standards," I told her over the phone. Rebecca actually suggested I consider removing the oak tree and replacing my gardens with low-maintenance landscaping. Marta's response was immediate and characteristically blunt. "Over my dead body, Ellie, that tree was there when we were children. Your garden's a living history. And frankly, these people need to learn that not everything in the world exists for their convenience." As I lay in bed that night, listening to the October wind rustle through the oak tree that Rebecca wanted gone, I found myself thinking about my grandfather. He'd been a surveyor and had helped plan much of Bellwood Glen's original development back in the 1920s. He'd always been proud of his role in preserving the area's natural character while allowing for responsible growth. The land remembers everything. He used to tell me when I was young, trees, stones, soil, they all hold the memory of what came before. Our job is to be good stewards, to pass on something better than what we inherited. I realized that for the first time since Eli's death. I had a purpose beyond simple maintenance and pleasant memories. The Everstones represented something larger than mere neighbourly conflict. They embodied a mindset that saw established beauty as outdated inconvenience, that valued potential profit over present harmony. But what they didn't know, what I was, only beginning to remember myself, was that my grandfather had been more than just a good steward. He'd been a man who planned for the future, who understood that sometimes protection required legal foundation as well as good intentions. Somewhere in his old papers, locked away in the strong box he'd left me, were documents that might change everything. Tomorrow, I decided, I would finally open that box and see what legacy he'd really left behind. The strong box sat exactly where it had for 6 years, tucked away in the back corner of my bedroom closet behind winter coats that still smell faintly of Eli's cologne. I'd avoided opening it since the funeral, telling myself I wasn't ready to face another layer of loss. But now I suspected my reluctance had been about something deeper than grief. My grandfather had been a methodical man, someone who believed in the power of careful documentation and legal preparation. The brass key hung on a chain I'd worn around my neck since I was 18, more from habit than intention. As I lifted the heavy metal lid, the hinges protested with a squeak that seemed to echo through decades of family history. Inside, beneath his World War I medals and my grandmother's pearl necklace, lay a leather portfolio tied with string that had faded from red to dusty pink. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it to reveal a collection of documents that told the story of Bellwood Glen's creation in meticulous detail. The first document was a survey map dated 1923, drawn in my grandfather's precise hand and labelled Bellwood Glen Development Plan, Final Survey. The map showed not just individual property lines, but something I'd never seen before. A comprehensive plan for preserving the area's character while allowing for thoughtful growth. Tree locations were marked and labelled as permanent preservation specimens. Natural water drainage patterns were carefully noted. Even the width of streets and positioning of houses seemed designed to work with the land rather than against it, but it was the second document that made my breath catch. Written in formal legal language, but bearing my grandfather's signature, it was titled Restrictive Covenant for the Preservation of Bellwood Glen Character and Natural Heritage. The language was dense and formal, filled with phrases like heirs and assigns and binding upon successive owners. But the core message was clear. Any significant changes to properties within the defined boundaries of Bellwood Glen required approval from the supervising family representative, a role that had been designated to pass through my grandfather's lineage. I read the document 3 times before its implications fully sank in. My grandfather hadn't just helped develop Bellwood Glen, he'd built in legal protections to prevent exactly the kind of aggressive modernisation the Everstones were pursuing. And somehow, through decades of quiet living, I'd inherited not just his house and garden, but his role as guardian of the entire neighbourhood's character. The third document was a handwritten letter addressed to my granddaughter, Eleanor, even. Seeing his familiar script made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. My dear Ellie, it began, if you are reading this, then circumstances have arisen that require you to understand the full extent of your inheritance. I have spent my life believing that foresight and preparation are acts of love. We protect what we cherish not through force, but through wisdom and legal foundation. The covenant I established for Bellwood Glen was not born from a desire to control, but from a deep understanding that some things, once lost, cannot be recovered. The natural beauty of this place, the character of these homes, the sense of community that grows slowly over generations, these are treasures that require active protection. I have given you not just property, but responsibility. Use this power wisely, and only when the essential character of our community is truly threatened. But do not hesitate to use it when that time comes. Sometimes the greatest kindness is the courage to say no. My hands were shaking as I set the letter aside and reached for the final document, a list of every property in Bellwood Glen, with notation dates showing when each deed had been recorded with the covenant language included. The Morrison place now. The Everstone property was clearly listed, with a date of 1954, and a note that the covenant had been duly recorded and binding upon all successive owners. I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by these papers, feeling as though I'd discovered a hidden room in a house I'd lived in my entire adult life. For 43 years, I'd been the quiet neighbour, the helpful gardener, the woman who minded her own business and asked for nothing more than to be left in peace. Now I learned that I'd been something else entirely, the keeper of a legal power that could protect not just my own property, but the entire character of Bellwood Glen. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Everstones, with their formal complaint letters and their research into municipal regulations, had been trying to use legal authority to force me into compliance with their vision. They'd assumed that age and widowhood had left me powerless, that quiet dignity meant weakness, that their wealth and energy could simply overwhelm my attachment to an older way of life. They had no idea that my grandfather had given me a legal foundation stronger than any municipal code, more binding than any homeowner association guideline. But understanding my power and knowing how to use it were entirely different challenges. The documents were clear in their language, but complex in their implications. I needed help understanding exactly what the covenant covered, how to invoke it properly, and what legal procedures would be required to make it effective. More importantly, I needed to decide whether I was truly ready to step into the role my grandfather had created for me. For 6 months, I'd absorbed the Everstones' complaints and suggestions with the resignation of someone who believed that keeping peace was more important than standing ground. Now I faced the possibility of not just resisting their demands, but actively blocking their plans. The next morning, I called Marta and asked her to come over for coffee and legal consultation. When I spread the documents across my kitchen table, her reaction was immediate and characteristically direct. "Holy hell, Ellie," she said, adjusting her reading glasses to examine the covenant language more closely. "Your grandfather was either incredibly prescient or incredibly paranoid, and either way, he's giving you the nuclear option for neighbourhood disputes." "But is it still valid?" I asked. "This was written almost a century ago." "Surely laws have changed." Marta spent 20 minutes reading through the documents with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent 40 years interpreting legal language. "Not only is it valid," she finally said, "it's bulletproof. Your grandfather clearly understood property law, and he wrote this covenant in language that would survive any number of legal challenges. The really beautiful part is that it was properly recorded with the county, which means every subsequent property transfer has included this language whether the buyers knew it or not. So the Everstones ... have been legally bound by this covenant since the day they signed their purchase agreement," Marta finished. "They just don't know it yet." We spent the rest of the morning going through the implications. The covenant was broad enough to cover major landscaping changes, structural modifications, and most significantly any sale of property that would materially alter the character or intended use of the land. Marta explained that this last clause would allow me to block not just modifications to existing properties, but any sale to developers who plan major changes. "The question," Marta said as we finished our second part of coffee, is what you want to do with this information. You could simply let the Everstones know about the covenant and watch them adjust their behavior accordingly, or you could wait and see if they push things far enough to require more dramatic intervention. That afternoon, as if the universe had a sense of timing, I received another letter from Rebecca. This one was different from her previous complaints, longer, more formal, and accompanied by what appeared to be a professionally prepared packet of materials. Dear Mrs. Brighton, it began, Chad and I have been discussing the ongoing challenges regarding property, maintenance, and neighbourhood aesthetics in our immediate area. We believe we've found a solution that could benefit everyone involved. We have been approached by Pinnacle Development Group, a respected firm that specialises in updating older neighbourhoods while preserving their essential charm. They have expressed interest in purchasing several properties in Bellwood Glen, including ours, with the intention of creating a coordinated renovation project that would modernise infrastructure while maintaining historical character. We realise this might seem overwhelming, but we believe this represents an exciting opportunity for property value enhancement and community improvement. The attached materials include preliminary plans and financial projections that demonstrate the potential benefits for all homeowners in the affected area. We would very much like to discuss this opportunity with you, as your property would be central to the overall plan's success. Perhaps we could schedule a time to meet and review these materials together. The attached packet was exactly what I'd expected: glossy renderings of updated colonial charm that looked like every other suburban development I'd seen, financial projections that reduced decades of careful cultivation to square footage, and market comparisons, and a map that showed my 3 acres of gardens labelled as potential green space, common area. I stared at that map for a long time, tracing the boundaries of the property where I'd learned to garden from my grandfather, where I'd built a marriage with Eli, where I'd created a community of women who found peace and purpose in working with the earth. In Pinnacle Development's vision, 43 years of love and labour became potential green space, sanitised, managed, accessible to everyone and meaningful to no one. That evening, I sat on the porch swing where Eli had proposed and where we'd planned every garden expansion, every tree planting, every small improvement that had transformed a house into a home. The October air carried the scent of my late-blooming roses and the sound of wind through leaves that would soon fall, enriching the soil for another spring's growth. For the first time since finding my grandfather's papers, I felt absolutely certain about what I needed to do. The Everstones could complain about my compost bins and suggest removing my oak tree, and I might have continued to absorb those complaints with patient dignity. But the moment they decided to sell my neighbourhood to developers, the moment they reduced my life's work to potential square footage, they had crossed a line that required more than patience. Tomorrow, I would call Marta and ask her to help me understand exactly how to invoke the covenant that my grandfather had left me. Not to be cruel or controlling, but to protect something that deserved protection, not just my own property, but the character of a place that had grown slowly and carefully over generations. The Everstones were about to discover that some things in this world were more powerful than money and ambition. Sometimes, the deepest power came from roots that ran deeper than anyone imagined. The next 2 weeks taught me more about legal strategy than I'd learned in 7 decades of avoiding conflict. Marta arrived each morning at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying a thermos of coffee and her old legal briefcase, transforming my kitchen table into a command centre for what she'd begun calling Operation Covenant Resurrection. The beautiful thing about your grandfather's document, she explained on day 3, spreading photocopies across my table, is that it doesn't require you to justify your decisions. You simply have the right to approve or disapprove major changes. The burden of proof falls on anyone who wants to challenge that authority, But understanding the law and implementing it were proving to be entirely different challenges. Marta insisted that before I made any public moves, I needed to research exactly what the Everstones and Pinnacle Development were planning. Information is power, she said, and right now they think they have all of it. The first piece of information came from an unexpected source. Jonah Linwood, the young zoning official who'd started working at the town hall 6 months earlier, arrived at my door on a Thursday afternoon with a clipboard and a nervous expression. "Mrs. Brighton," he said, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to talk to you about some applications that have been submitted regarding your neighbourhood." Jonah was perhaps 26, with the earnest energy of someone who'd chosen municipal work because he genuinely believed in good governance. I'd met him briefly at a town selectmen's meeting where he'd impressed me with his thoughtful questions about balancing development with historic preservation. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, leading him to the kitchen. "And please, call me Ellie. Over chamomile tea and molasses cookies." Jonah explained that Pinnacle Development had submitted preliminary applications for what they called a neighbourhood renovation project. The applications were vague about specifics, but clear about scope. They wanted to purchase and modify at least 6 properties in Bellwood Glen, including mine. "The thing is," Jonah said, carefully setting down his teacup, "I've been doing some research into the historical development of this area, and I found some interesting documentation." "Did you know your grandfather was instrumental in the original planning?" I smiled, thinking of the documents upstairs in my closet. "I'm learning more about that every day." "Well, I found the original covenant language in the county records, and I have to say, it's fascinating from a legal perspective. Your grandfather was clearly thinking decades ahead about protecting community character." Jonah's revelation confirmed what Marta and I had suspected: the covenant was officially recorded and legally binding. But more importantly, it told me that I had an ally in someone who understood both the legal framework and the value of what my grandfather had been trying to protect. "What I don't understand," Jonah continued, "is how Pinnacle could proceed with their applications without acknowledging the covenant restrictions. Either they haven't done proper due diligence, or they're assuming it won't be enforced." That evening, I called Rebecca and asked if she and Chad would like to come over for coffee the next morning. "I'd like to discuss your development proposal," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Rebecca's enthusiasm was immediate and transparent. "Oh, wonderful. Chad and I have been hoping you'd be open to hearing more details. This could be such an exciting opportunity for everyone." The next morning, the Everstones arrived precisely on time, Chad carrying a laptop and Rebecca armed with a folder thick with promotional materials. They settled into my living room with the confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted through presentation and persistence. "Before we begin," I said, serving coffee in my grandmother's china, "I want to make sure I understand exactly what you're proposing for the next hour." Chad and Rebecca walked me through Pinnacle Development's vision with the polished enthusiasm of a sales presentation. They spoke about maximizing property potential and bringing the neighborhood into the modern era while showing me computer-generated images of houses that bore only superficial resemblance to the originals. "The wonderful thing," Rebecca said, "is that everyone benefits. Property values increase dramatically, the neighborhood gets updated infrastructure, and we all enjoy enhanced community amenities. And my property." I asked quietly. Chad leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering good news. "Obviously, your gardens are beautiful, but they require enormous maintenance. Pinnacle's plan would preserve the essential character while creating managed green space that the entire community could enjoy. Think of it as sharing your love of gardening with everyone." I set down my coffee cup and looked at these young people who had somehow convinced themselves that destroying something beautiful was the same as sharing it. "And if I prefer to keep my property as it is," Rebecca's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Well, obviously that's your choice, but you'd be surrounded by construction and renovation for quite some time. It might be more pleasant to be part of the coordinated effort. The threat was delivered with such pleasant efficiency that I almost admired their technique. But sitting in my living room, surrounded by furniture that my grandfather had built and photographs that chronicled for generations of life in this house, I felt something crystallize inside me that had been building since the day I'd found the Covenant documents. That's an interesting perspective, I said carefully. Before I make any decisions, though, I think there's something you should know about the legal framework governing property changes in Bellwood Glen. I excused myself and retrieved the Covenant documents from upstairs, returning to find Chad and Rebecca exchanging glances that suggested they were running calculations about my mental competence. My grandfather was one of the original developers of this neighborhood, I began, sitting back down with the papers in my lap. He had very specific ideas about preserving its character for future generations. I read them the relevant sections of the Covenant, watching their expressions shift from polite attention to confusion to something approaching alarm. Chad asked to see the documents, studying the legal language with the focused intensity of someone who just realized their assumptions might be wrong. This can't possibly still be valid, Rebecca said after Chad had finished reading. These documents are almost 100 years old. Actually, I said, property covenants don't expire unless specifically written to do so. And this one was recorded with the county, making it binding on all subsequent property owners. Chad looked up from the papers with the expression of someone recalculating a complex equation. Are you saying you have veto power over our sale to Pinnacle? I'm saying that any major modifications to properties in Bellwood Glen require approval from the designated family representative, I replied. That role is passed to me through my grandfather's lineage. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Rebecca's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, revealing something harder underneath. Double quotes, Mrs. Brighton, she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Surely you're not going to let some ancient legal technicality prevent progress that would benefit the entire community. I'm not preventing anything, I said gently. I'm simply making sure I understand all the implications before making any decisions. After the Everstones left more abruptly than they'd arrived, I called Marta to report on the conversation. Her laughter was immediate and delighted. Oh, this is beautiful, she said. They came in thinking they were selling you on their vision, and you just handed them a legal reality they never saw coming. How long do you think it'll take them to call their lawyers? Not long, I said, watching through my window as Chad paced their driveway while talking animatedly on his phone. That afternoon brought a steady stream of activity at the Everstone house. First, a man in an expensive suit who stayed for 2 hours, then a woman with a briefcase who conferred with Rebecca on the front lawn while pointing at various properties. Finally, a crew from Pinnacle Development who spent an hour taking photographs and measurements. By evening, my phone was ringing. The caller identified himself as Marcus Webb, legal counsel for Pinnacle Development Group. Mrs. Brighton, he said, in the tone of someone accustomed to solving problems through intimidation. I understand there may be some questions about a historical property document. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss how we can move forward constructively. Mr. Webb, I replied, I'm certainly willing to discuss the covenant. You might want to have your legal team review the county records first, though. The documentation is quite comprehensive. The conversation that followed was a careful dance of legal posturing. Webb tried to suggest that the covenant might not apply to Pinnacle's specific plans, that its enforceability was questionable, that surely a reasonable resolution could be found that satisfied everyone's interests. I listened politely and responded with phrases Marta had coached me to use. I'll need to review that with my legal counsel. The covenant language seems quite clear on that point. I'm sure you understand my obligation to protect the neighborhood's interests. After hanging up, I sat in my garden as the sun set behind the oak tree that Rebecca wanted removed. The late October air carried the scent of leaves preparing for winter, and I could hear the evening sounds that had provided the soundtrack for 43 years of life in this place wind through branches. The distant sound of the river, the soft rustle of small creatures settling in for the night. For the first time since this conflict began, I felt truly calm. Not the resignation I'd been cultivating for months, but the deep peace that comes from knowing you're standing on solid ground. The Everstones could bring their lawyers and their developers, their financial projections and their threats about construction disruption. But I had something more powerful than their money and influence. I had roots that went deeper than they'd imagined. Legal protection that my grandfather had planted like a slow-growing tree that was finally ready to bear fruit, and the quiet confidence that comes from defending something that deserves defense. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. But tonight, in my garden, surrounded by the legacy that 3 generations of my family had built and protected, I was ready for whatever came next. The weekend brought an unexpected reprieve, and an even more unexpected source of support, my Saturday garden class, which had dwindled to just 3 brave souls during the height of the Everstone complaints, suddenly included 12 women. Word had apparently spread through town about my legal confrontation with the developers, and curiosity had brought out gardeners I hadn't seen in months. Martha Henley arrived early, as usual, but instead of her normal bag of gardening gloves and pruning shears, she carried a covered dish and a determined expression. "I brought reinforcements," she announced, nodding toward the driveway where cars were still arriving. "And Lucy Morrison's apple cake, because we're going to need sustenance for this conversation." The women gathered in my kitchen represented 3 generations of Bellwood Glen residents. There was Sarah Chen, who'd bought her first house 2 years earlier and was still learning the basics of perennial care. Linda Kowalski, who'd moved here from Boston 15 years ago and had become the neighborhood's unofficial historian. Gloria Simmons, who lived across the street from the Everstones and had been caught in the middle of our conflict, and Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired professor who'd been attending my classes for 5 years and had developed impressive expertise with heirloom tomatoes. "Ellie," Martha said once everyone had settled with coffee and cake, "we want you to know that what you're doing matters to all of us." "I'm not sure I'm doing anything yet," I said carefully. "I'm just trying to understand my options." Linda Kowalski, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up with surprising intensity. "You're standing up to people who think money gives them the right to change everything without asking anyone's opinion. Do you know Rebecca actually suggested to me that my colonial saltbox would look more cohesive if I painted it white instead of the blue it's been for 30 years. The conversation that followed revealed the extent to which the Everstones' complaints about my property had been part of a broader campaign to reshape the neighborhood according to their aesthetic preferences. Nearly every woman present had received suggestions about updates that would improve property values and neighborhood appeal. "The thing is," said Dr. Williams, "they're not wrong about the property values. The kind of renovation they're talking about would probably increase everyone's equity significantly." "But at what cost?" Sarah Chen asked. "I moved here because I love the character of these old houses and gardens. If I'd wanted to live in a development with managed green space and updated everything, I could have saved money and bought in." Westfield. Gloria Simmons had been uncharacteristically quiet during this discussion, but finally spoke up with the tone of someone who'd been wrestling with competing loyalties. "I have to admit," she said, "part of me has been tempted by what Rebecca's describing. The financial projections are impressive, and some of these houses do need updating. But yesterday she suggested that your garden classes were incompatible with the neighborhood's evolving character, and that made me realize what we'd be losing. The conversation continued for over an hour, with each woman sharing her perspective on the balance between preservation and progress, between individual property rights and community character. What emerged was a clear consensus that while change wasn't inherently bad, the kind of change pinnacle development represented would fundamentally alter what had drawn each of them to Bellwood Glen in the first place. The question, Martha said, as we moved outside to begin the actual gardening portion of our morning, is what we can do to support you if this turns into a legal battle. That afternoon, Martha arrived with a briefcase full of legal research and a plan of action that was both comprehensive and elegant. I've been digging into Pinnacle Development's track record, she said, spreading files across my kitchen table. They're exactly what you'd expect a firm that specializes in buying up older neighborhoods, updating them to contemporary standards, and flipping them for maximum profit. They've done similar projects in 6 other New England towns over the past 5 years. The photographs Martha had gathered told a consistent story. In each case, Pinnacle had preserved enough original architectural elements to claim they were maintaining historical character while fundamentally transforming the communities into upscale suburban developments that looked almost identical to each other. The beautiful part, Martha continued, is that your covenant is airtight. I've had 3 different property lawyers review the language, and they all agree you have absolute authority to approve or disapprove any major modifications or sales that would alter the character of the neighborhood. But what about the practical aspects? I asked. If I say no to the Pinnacle deal, what happens to the Everstones? Do they lose money? Can they sue me? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Martha's smile was sharp and satisfied. They can certainly try to sue, but they'd be fighting a property covenant that was properly established and legally recorded. As for losing money, that's not your problem. They bought property that was legally encumbered by restrictions, whether they bothered to research those restrictions or not. The legal strategy Martha outlined was straightforward. First, we would formally notify Pinnacle Development and the Everstones that any sales or major modifications within the covenant's jurisdiction required my approval. Second, we would request detailed plans for their proposed changes, giving me legal standing to evaluate whether they violated the covenant's preservation requirements. Third, we would document my decision-making process to protect against any claims that my authority was being used arbitrarily or maliciously. The key, Martha explained, is that you're not required to provide detailed justifications for your decisions. The covenant gives you discretionary authority to protect the neighborhood's character. As long as you're not acting in obvious bad faith, your decisions are legally binding. That evening, I sat in my study, the small room overlooking the garden where Eli had graded papers for 30 years, and drafted my formal response to Pinnacle Development. The letter was brief and professional, informing them that I was the designated family representative for the Bellwood Glen Restrictive Covenant, that any major property modifications within the covered area required my approval, and that I would need to review detailed plans before making any decisions about their proposed development. Writing that letter felt like crossing a threshold I hadn't fully acknowledged I was approaching. For 6 months, I'd been reactive, absorbing complaints, defending my existing practices, trying to maintain peace through accommodation. Now I was taking a proactive stance, asserting legal authority I'd inherited but never exercised. The difference in my own mindset was profound. Instead of feeling defensive about my gardens and my lifestyle, I felt protective of something larger, the character and history of a place that deserved preservation, not because it was perfect, but because it was authentic. Tuesday morning brought Pinnacle Development's response in the form of Marcus Webb himself, accompanied by a younger associate, and a briefcase that looked substantial enough to contain either comprehensive legal arguments or blunt instruments. "Mrs. Brighton," Webb said as I led them into my living room, "I appreciate your willingness to meet with us. I think there may be some misunderstandings about the scope and enforceability of the document you're citing. For the next hour, Webb made his case with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating opposition through legal expertise and sheer force of professional authority. He suggested that the covenant might not apply to Pinnacle's specific type of development, that its language was too vague to be enforceable, that modern property law had evolved beyond the framework my grandfather had established. I listened, politely, serving coffee and asking clarifying questions, while mentally cataloguing each argument for Marta's later analysis. Webb's presentation was impressive and thoroughly prepared, but it had one fundamental flaw. It was based on the assumption that I was an elderly widow who could be confused by legal complexity and intimidated by professional authority. When he finished, I thanked him for his time and handed him a copy of my formal letter requesting detailed plans for Pinnacle's proposed modifications. "Mr. Webb," I said as he gathered his materials, "I'm sure you understand that I have an obligation to protect the interests this covenant was designed to serve. I look forward to reviewing your development plans and making an informed decision about their compatibility with those interests." After they left, I called Marta to report on the meeting and share Webb's arguments. Her laughter was immediate and reassuring. "Oh, Ellie," she said, "that man just made every mistake lawyers make when they underestimate their opposition. He's trying to argue around a document instead of challenging its validity, which means he knows it's legally sound. And he's assuming you don't understand the law well enough to see through his intimidation tactics. So what happens next? Next, they send you their plans, you review them with appropriate legal counsel, and you make your decision based on the covenant's preservation requirements. And if they don't like your decision, they can challenge it in court where they'll have to prove that a properly recorded property covenant shouldn't be enforced." That evening, as I walked through my gardens in the gathering dusk, I found myself thinking about legacy in ways I hadn't considered since Eli's death. My grandfather had planted legal protection like a slow-growing tree, trusting that future generations would understand its value when the time came to use it. Now I was discovering that sometimes the greatest gift we can leave behind isn't property or money, but the tools others will need to protect what matters. The Everstones wanted to modernize Bellwood Glen according to their vision of improvement and progress. But I was beginning to understand that some forms of progress require preservation, that protecting authentic beauty is itself a form of courage, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to let other people define your choices. For you. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressure, new attempts to convince me that resistance was pointless and accommodation was inevitable. But tonight, in the garden where 3 generations of my family had learned the patience that comes from nurturing growth, I felt ready for whatever came next. The Pinnacle development plans arrived on a Thursday afternoon via courier, delivered in a box substantial enough to contain architectural blueprints for a small city. Inside were detailed renderings, financial projections, environmental impact studies, and legal opinions that clearly represented hundreds of hours of professional preparation. I spread the materials across my dining room table and spent the rest of the afternoon studying what Pinnacle considered preservation-minded renovation that enhances, rather than replaces, existing neighbourhood character. The reality was both more sophisticated and more devastating than I'd expected. Unlike the crude modernization I'd feared, Pinnacle's plans showed genuine attention to architectural detail and historical accuracy. They proposed to maintain the basic structure and footprint of each house while updating infrastructure, adding luxury amenities, and creating what they call coordinated landscape design that would replace individual gardens with professionally Manage green space. The rendering of my own property was particularly jarring. The house itself looked almost identical, with careful preservation of the roofline, windows, and exterior details that gave it character. But my 3 acres of gardens had been transformed into a manicured park with walking paths, bench seating, and plantings that looked like they'd been selected by a committee for maximum visual impact and minimum maintenance requirements. It was beautiful in its way, professional, polished, accessible. It was also completely soulless, bearing the same relationship to my actual garden that a museum display bears to a living ecosystem. The financial projections were equally impressive and troubling. Pinnacle estimated that their renovations would increase property values by an average of 40%, generating substantial equity gains for every homeowner who participated. For neighbours like Sarah Chen, who was still paying off a large mortgage, that kind of equity increase could be genuinely life-changing. But buried in the detailed financial appendix was information that made my throat tighten with anger. Pinnacle's business model was based on purchasing properties at current market value, implementing their renovations, and then reselling at the enhanced values. Homeowners who participated would receive their equity gains, but they'd also be priced out of the neighbourhood that helped improve. The environmental impact study was particularly cynical. It described my current gardens as inefficient use of available green space and suggested that Pinnacle's managed landscaping would provide enhanced environmental benefits through professionally optimized plant selection and water management systems. I was still reading when Marta arrived for our scheduled review of the documents. Her reaction to the materials was immediate and characteristically blunt. "This is sophisticated propaganda," she said, after spending an hour going through the plans. "They're not wrong about the quality of their work, and they're not lying about the financial benefits, but they're fundamentally misrepresenting what those benefits would cost." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Look at the before and after photographs from their previous projects," Marta said, flipping to a section I hadn't examined closely. "Every one of these neighbourhoods now looks like every other one. They preserve architectural detail while destroying community character. It's like maintaining the shell of something while removing everything that made it alive." As we continued reviewing the documents, Marta identified several legal strategies Pinnacle was using to argue around the covenant restrictions. They claimed their renovations constituted preservation and enhancement rather than material alteration. They argued that professionally managed landscaping was superior to individual property maintenance. Most importantly, they suggested that blocking their development would constitute unreasonable interference with legitimate property rights. "The problem," Marta explained, "is that these aren't entirely unreasonable arguments. A court might find that some of their proposed changes fall within acceptable parameters of the covenant language. So they might win if this goes to litigation. They might win some battles," Marta said, "but they can't win the war. Your grandfather's covenant is broad enough to give you authority over any changes that materially alter neighbourhood character. The key is documenting that your decisions are based on legitimate preservation concerns rather than arbitrary personal preference that weak and broaden unexpected development that change the entire dynamic of our conflict." Gloria Simmons knocked on my door Saturday morning with news that she'd initially thought I'd want to hear. "Ellie," she said, settling into my kitchen with the air of someone carrying significant gossip, "Rebecca and Chad are having some kind of crisis. I heard them fighting yesterday afternoon, shouting loud enough that I could hear them through the windows." The argument, according to Gloria, had centered on the financial implications of the stalled Pinnacle deal. Chad wanted to proceed with legal challenges to the covenant, while Rebecca favored trying to negotiate some kind of compromise that would allow them to salvage their investment. "But here's the really interesting part," Gloria continued. "I happened to be walking by when their real estate agent arrived, and I overheard him telling them that if the pinochle deal falls through, they might have trouble selling it all. Apparently, the covenant restrictions are now officially part of the property. Disclosure requirements. This information was both satisfying and troubling. I'd succeeded in protecting the neighbourhood from Pinnacle's development, but I'd also potentially trapped the Everstones in a property they now wanted to leave, but couldn't easily sell. That afternoon, I was working in my garden when Rebecca appeared at the gate that separated our properties. She looked different than I'd seen her before, less polished, more genuinely distressed. "Mrs. Brighton," she said, "could I talk to you for a few minutes?" I set down my pruning shears and invited her to sit on the bench Eli had built under the apple tree. For several minutes, we sat in silence while Rebecca gathered herself to say whatever she'd come to say. "I owe you an apology," she finally began. "Chad and I came here thinking we understood what we wanted and how to get it. We never considered that other people might have different priorities, or that those priorities might be legally protected." It was the first genuine conversation we'd had since she'd moved to Bellwood Glen, and I found myself listening with more sympathy than I'd expected to feel. "The truth is," Rebecca continued, "we're in over our heads financially. Chad's firm is restructuring, and we need the equity from this house to cover some investments that didn't work out the way we'd hoped. The Pinnacle deal would have solved all our problems, but now we're stuck with a property we can't afford and apparently can't sell." I studied this young woman who'd spent months treating me as an obstacle to her plans, now revealing herself as someone facing her own form of powerlessness. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd assumed that age and widowhood made me vulnerable, when in fact it was youth and overextension that had left her without options. "Rebecca," I said carefully, "I never intended to trap you in a situation you can't manage. The covenant exists to protect the neighbourhood's character, not to prevent people from making necessary changes to their lives. But you won't approve the Pinnacle sale," she said, and there was more resignation than accusation in her voice. "I can approve a development that would fundamentally alter what makes this place special," I replied. "But that doesn't mean there aren't other options." What followed was the most honest conversation Rebecca and I had ever had. I learned that she'd been a lifestyle blogger before marrying Chad, that she'd given up her own career to support his ambitions, that the aggressive modernization campaign had been partly driven by a need to feel like she was creating something meaningful. "I know you think I don't understand what you've built here," she said, gesturing toward my gardens, "but I do understand beauty. I just don't know how to create the kind of beauty that lasts." By the time our conversation ended, we'd reached an understanding that surprised both of us. Rebecca would withdraw from the Pinnacle deal and stop pursuing legal challenges to the covenant. In exchange, I would help her find a buyer who appreciated the neighbourhood's existing character and would work within the covenant's preservation requirements. "It might take longer," I told her, "and you might not get the same financial return. But you'll be able to sell to someone who wants what Bellwood Glen actually offers, rather than what they think it could become." That evening, I called Marta to report on this unexpected development. Her reaction was typically direct. "You realize you just gave up your strongest negotiating position," she said. "You could have let them struggle with the consequences of their own assumptions." "Maybe," I said, "but that would have made me the kind of person who uses power to punish rather than protect." My grandfather's covenant was designed to preserve community character, not trap people in situations they can't manage. "Fair enough," Marta replied, "but you'd better make sure Rebecca follows through on her commitments. Some people view kindness as weakness." Over the following weeks, I learned that Marta's concern was justified but incomplete. Rebecca did honour her agreement. She formally withdrew from the Pinnacle deal and stopped filing complaints about my property. But she also began a subtle campaign to convince other neighbours that I was preventing progress that would benefit everyone. The campaign was sophisticated and emotionally manipulative. Rebecca framed herself as someone who'd tried to improve the neighborhood for everyone's benefit, only to be blocked by an elderly woman too attached to the past to consider the future. She shared financial projections showing how much equity each family was losing by not participating in the pinnacle development. She organized informal coffee gatherings where she encouraged neighbors to voice their frustrations about property, maintenance costs, and aging infrastructure. The strategy was effective enough to create genuine divisions within the community. Sarah Chen stopped attending my garden classes, explaining apologetically that she needed to be neutral in the neighborhood conflict. Linda Kowalski remained supportive, but reported that she was facing pressure from her husband to reconsider their position. Even Gloria Simmons, who'd been firmly on my side, began expressing doubts about whether I was being fair to people who could genuinely benefit from the property value increases. The crisis came to a head 3 weeks later when I received a formal petition signed by 8 of my neighbors, requesting that I reconsider my decision regarding the pinnacle development. The petition was respectful, but clear. A majority of affected property owners believed the development would benefit the community and asked me to approve the project. That night, sitting in my study with the petition spread before me, I faced the hardest decision I'd made since this conflict began. I had the legal authority to maintain my position regardless of neighborhood opinion. The covenant gave me discretionary power that couldn't be overruled by majority vote or popular pressure, but I also had to live with the consequences of my choices. If I continued to block development that a majority of my neighbors wanted, I would spend my remaining years in a community where I was seen as an obstacle to progress rather than a protector of character. The question was whether I believed strongly enough in my grandfather's vision to stand alone when necessary, or whether community harmony was more important than the principles I'd been fighting to preserve. Outside my window, the oak tree that Rebecca had wanted to remove swayed in the autumn wind, its roots anchored deep enough to weather storms that would topple younger growth. Perhaps that was my answer: some things are worth protecting not because they're popular, but because they're irreplaceable once lost. Tomorrow, I would give the neighbors my final decision about the pinnacle development. But tonight, I was finally certain about what that decision would be. I spent the morning of my decision in the garden, working with my hands in the soil that had taught me everything I knew about patience, persistence, and the difference between cultivation and control. The late November air carried the sharp clarity that comes just before winter, and I found myself thinking about cycles: how gardens die back each fall only to emerge transformed in spring, how endings and beginnings are often the same moment seen from different angles. Marta arrived at 9 o'clock with coffee and the legal brief we'd been preparing for 3 weeks. The document was comprehensive but elegant, laying out my decision regarding the pinnacle development with detailed reasoning that would protect against any claims of arbitrary or malicious use of covenant authority. "You're sure about this?" she asked as we reviewed the final draft one more time. "I'm sure about the principles," I said. "I'm less sure about the consequences." The legal brief was structured around 3 core arguments. First, that pinnacles proposed development constituted material alteration of neighborhood character despite their claims of preservation-minded renovation. Second, that the covenant specifically protected against the kind of coordinated redevelopment that prioritized economic value over community continuity. Third, that approving the project would set a precedent that would effectively nullify the covenant's protective purpose. But beyond the legal arguments, I'd included a personal statement explaining my decision in terms that any neighbor could understand. I wrote about my grandfather's vision for Bellwood Glen, about the difference between preservation and stagnation, about the value of places that grew organically over time rather than being designed by committee. "The thing I want people to understand," I told Marta as we finished our review, "is that I'm not opposed to change. I'm opposed to change that erases rather than builds on what came before. The neighbourhood meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock in the community room at the town library. By the time I arrived, carrying my legal brief and the original covenant documents, nearly 30 people had gathered, not just immediate neighbours, but residents from throughout Bellwood Glen who'd heard about the controversy and wanted to understand its implications. Jonah Linwood had volunteered to facilitate the meeting, and he began by explaining the legal framework that gave me authority over major property modifications. His presentation was neutral and informative, covering both the historical background of the covenant and the current application to Pinnacle's development proposal. When he invited me to present my decision, I stood before a room that included people who'd supported me throughout this conflict, people who'd opposed me, and people who were still trying to understand what was at stake. 6 months ago, I began. I thought this was a simple dispute about property maintenance and neighbourhood aesthetics. I've learned that it's really about two different visions of what communities can be and how they should grow. I read sections of my legal brief explaining why Pinnacle's development violated the covenant's preservation requirements, but I spent most of my time talking about the less tangible values at stake. I described walking through neighbourhoods that Pinnacle had improved, seeing how professional landscaping had replaced the quirky individual gardens that gave places personality. I talked about the difference between property value and actual value, between efficiency and character, between managing spaces and living in them. I understand that some of you are disappointed by my decision, I said, looking directly at neighbours who'd signed the petition requesting reconsideration. I understand that the financial benefits Pinnacle offered were significant and appealing, but I also believe that some things, once lost, can't be recovered at any price. The discussion that followed was more civil than I'd expected, but more painful than I'd hoped. Sarah Chen spoke about her mortgage payments and the stress of maintaining an old house on a teacher's salary. Linda Kowalski's husband explained how the equity from a Pinnacle sale would have funded their retirement plans. Gloria Simmons talked about feeling caught between loyalty to neighbours and practical considerations about her family's financial future. Each concern was legitimate and heartfelt, and each one made me question whether I was being selfish in prioritising preservation over people's immediate needs. But then Martha Henley stood up with the authority that came from 8 decades of life experience and 40 years of community leadership. I've lived through 3 different waves of development pressure in this town, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Each time, people promised that change would make everything better, more efficient, more valuable, more modern. And each time, we lost something irreplaceable in exchange for benefits that turned out to be temporary. Martha's speech shifted the energy in the room by providing historical perspective that most of us lacked. She described neighbourhoods that had been improved into uniformity, communities that had traded character for convenience and spent decades trying to recover what they'd lost. Eleanor isn't preventing progress, Martha concluded. She's protecting the foundation that makes genuine progress possible. You can't build community on land that's been scraped clean of everything that made it meaningful. Dr. Patricia Williams spoke next, supporting my decision with the perspective of someone who'd studied community development professionally. She explained how places like Bellwood Glen represented increasingly rare examples of organic growth and authentic character in a landscape dominated by planned developments and corporate landscaping. But the most surprising support came from Jonah Linwood, who spoke not as the meeting facilitator, but as a young professional who'd chosen municipal work because he believed in the value of thoughtful planning. I've reviewed dozens of development proposals in my time here, he said, and most of them follow the same pattern: maximize economic return while minimizing anything that can't be quantified or managed. Mrs. Brighton's covenant represents something different: protection for values that don't show up on financial projections but make places worth living in. The meeting ended without formal votes or official resolutions, but with something more valuable, a clearer understanding of what was actually at stake in our conflict. People left with my legal brief and copies of the original covenant documents, and I'd given them a way to understand my decision that went beyond legal authority to the principles that guided its use. Over the following days, I began to see evidence that the community conversation had created space for perspectives that hadn't been heard during the peak of development pressure. Neighbours who'd been quietly uncomfortable with Pinnacle's plans, but reluctant to oppose them, publicly began expressing support for preservation. People who'd signed the petition requesting reconsideration reached out to apologise, explaining that they'd felt pressure to choose sides without fully understanding their options. Most importantly, Sarah Chen knocked on my door Thursday evening with a request that surprised and touched me deeply. "Ellie," she said, "I wonder if you'd be willing to help me understand what's actually involved in maintaining an old house and garden. I've been so focused on the financial burden that I never considered whether there might be rewards I was missing." That conversation led to others, and by the end of the week I'd scheduled individual meetings with 6 neighbours who wanted to explore alternatives to the Pinnacle development. Instead of coordinated redevelopment that would modernise everything. Simultaneously, we began discussing collaborative approaches to maintenance and improvement that would preserve character while addressing practical concerns. Linda Kowalski suggested organising a neighbourhood work group that could share resources and expertise for projects like window restoration and garden maintenance. Sarah Chen proposed applying for historical preservation grants that could help offset the costs of maintaining older properties. Dr. Williams offered to research tax incentives available for historical preservation that might provide some of the financial benefits that Pinnacle had promised. The most significant development came from an unexpected source, Rebecca Everstone, who'd been quiet since our conversation under the apple tree, asked if she could join these planning discussions. "I realize I approached this whole situation backward," she told me during a private conversation Friday afternoon. "I was trying to impose my vision instead of learning what was already here. If you're willing to help me understand how to work with this place instead of against it, I'd like to try a different approach." What emerged from these conversations was something I hadn't dared hope for: a community-led alternative to corporate development that could address people's practical needs while preserving the character that made Bellwood Glen worth protecting. The plan we developed wasn't as financially lucrative as Pinnacle's proposal, but it was more sustainable and more responsive to what residents actually wanted. Instead of managed green space, we would maintain individual gardens while sharing resources and knowledge. Instead of coordinated renovation, we would help each other with maintenance and improvements that preserved historical character while updating functionality. Most importantly, we would remain in control of our own community's evolution instead of handing that control to developers whose primary loyalty was to their own profit margins. As November turned to December, I realized that the conflict with Pinnacle development had accomplished something I'd never expected. It had transformed a collection of individual homeowners into something approaching a genuine community. People who'd barely spoken before were now collaborating on projects and sharing resources. Neighbours who'd been focused primarily on property values were discovering the less quantifiable benefits of living in a place with authentic character and history. The Everstones found a beer for their property, a young couple with children, who were specifically attracted to Bellwood Glen's established character and community feel. The sale price was lower than what Pinnacle would have offered, but it was enough to resolve their financial pressures while bringing new neighbours who appreciated what we'd been working to preserve. On the last day of November, I sat in my study, writing thank you notes to neighbours who'd supported the preservation effort. Outside my window, the oak tree stood bare against the grey sky, its roots anchored deep enough to weather any storm, its branches strong enough to support new growth when spring returned. I discovered that sometimes the greatest gift you can give a community is the courage to say no to changes that look like progress, but would actually represent loss. The covenant my grandfather had written 90 years earlier had given me the legal tools to protect Bellwood Glen's character. But it had taken this conflict to teach me that preservation requires more than legal authority. It requires the wisdom to use that authority in service of values larger than individual convenience or financial gain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that places worth living in are worth fighting for. But tonight, in the house where 3 generations of my family had learned the patience that comes from nurture and growth, I felt ready for whatever came next. The town hall meeting where I would formally present my decision regarding the Pinnacle development was scheduled for the second Tuesday in December. Word had spread beyond Bellwood Glen, and by 7 o'clock the main meeting room was packed, with residents from throughout the area who'd come to witness what the local newspaper had dubbed the Great Preservation Battle. I'd spent the morning in my garden, gathering the last of the winter herbs and reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a quiet widow content to tend my plants and avoid conflict. Now I was about to address a packed room about the courage required to protect what matters against pressure that disguises destruction as improvement. Marta had driven over early to help me prepare, carrying the briefcase that had become our command center, and wearing her courtroom face the expression that had intimidated opposing counsel for 40 years. "Remember," she said, as we reviewed my notes one final time, "you're not defending your decision tonight. You're explaining principles that transcend this particular conflict. Make them understand that this is about more than one development proposal." The drive to town hall was quiet, both of us lost in thoughts about the magnitude of what we were attempting. We weren't just blocking a development project. We were asserting that communities have the right to protect their own character against economic pressure, that legal frameworks exist to serve values larger than profit maximization, that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to let other people define your choices. Jonah Linwood met us at the entrance and escorted us through the crowd to the front of the room. I'd expected tension and hostility, but the atmosphere felt more like curiosity than confrontation. People were genuinely interested in understanding how a 71-year-old widow had managed to stop a multi-million-dollar development project, and whether the principles involved had implications for their own communities. The formal presentation began with Marcus Webb, Pinnacle Development's attorney, making one final argument for approval of their project. His presentation was polished and comprehensive, emphasizing the economic benefits, the quality of their architectural work, and the legal arguments questioning the covenant's applicability to their specific proposal. Mrs. Brighton's interpretation of this historical document, Webb concluded, represents an unreasonable constraint on legitimate property rights and economic development that would benefit the entire community. We respectfully request that the town support our legal challenge to this covenant's enforceability. When Jonah introduced me, I walked to the podium carrying the original covenant documents and the legal brief Marta and I had prepared, but I also carried something less tangible, the confidence that comes from standing on solid ground, defending principles that transcend personal convenience or financial gain. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, 6 months ago, I thought this was a simple dispute about compost bins and oak trees. I've learned that it's really about the different visions of how communities should grow and who gets to make decisions about that growth. I started by reading key sections of my grandfather's covenant, explaining how his work as a surveyor had given him deep understanding of the relationship between careful planning and community character. I described his vision for development that worked with natural systems rather than against them, that preserved what was valuable while allowing for thoughtful change. My grandfather understood something that we're in danger of forgetting. I continued, Not all change represents progress. Some change erases rather than builds on what came before, destroys rather than improves, profits some people while impoverishing the community as a whole. I then walk the audience through Pinnacle's development proposal, using their own renderings to illustrate how professional landscaping would replace the quirky, individual gardens that gave Bellwood Glen its personality. I showed photographs from their previous projects, demonstrating how preservation-minded renovation had resulted in neighborhoods that looked professionally maintained, but culturally sterile. The question isn't whether Pinnacle does quality work, I said. The question is whether their vision of quality serves the community it claims to improve. But the heart of my presentation focused on something larger than this particular conflict: the right of communities to protect their own character against pressure that frames economic benefit as the highest good. For 6 months, I explained, I've been told that my attachment to this place is nostalgia, that my resistance to change is selfishness, that my use of legal authority is unreasonable. But preserving what's valuable isn't nostalgia, it's stewardship. Resisting change that destroys isn't selfishness, it's community responsibility. Using legal authority to protect what matters isn't unreasonable, it's exactly what legal frameworks are designed to accomplish. I talked about the difference between places that grow organically over time and places that are designed by committee to maximize efficiency and profit. I described communities I'd visited where every tree was the same species, every house was painted acceptable colors, every garden was maintained to professional standards, and how those places felt more like outdoor shopping malls than neighborhoods, where people built lives and relationships. Bellwood Glen isn't perfect, I said, but it's authentic. People live here because they appreciate character over convenience, community over commerce, the beauty that comes from individual expression, within a framework of mutual respect. Pinnacle's development would preserve our architectural details while destroying everything that makes this place worth living in. The most important part of my presentation addressed the economic arguments that Webb had emphasized. I acknowledged that Pinnacle's development would increase property value significantly, that the financial benefits were real and appealing. But I also explained what those benefits would cost in terms that went beyond money. Property values increase when places become more desirable, I said, but they also increase when places become more generic, more professionally managed, more similar to every other upscale suburban development. The question is whether we want to live in a place that's valuable because it's like everywhere else, or valuable because it's like nowhere else. I concluded my presentation with a personal reflection that I debated including, but ultimately felt was necessary. I'm 71 years old, I said, and I won't live to see all the consequences of the decisions we make tonight. But I have to believe that communities are worth more than their property values, that beauty is worth more than efficiency, that some things deserve protection not because they're profitable but because they're irreplaceable once lost. The discussion that followed was more substantive than I'd expected. Residents from other communities shared their experiences with similar development pressures, describing both successful preservation efforts and places where commercial interests had overwhelmed community character. Local business owners talked about the relationship between authentic community identity and long-term economic health. Even some supporters of the Pinnacle development acknowledged that my arguments had given them new perspectives to consider. The most powerful moment came when Martha Henley stood up to address the room with the authority that came from 8 decades of community involvement. I've watched this town change for 70 years, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. I've seen improvements that made life better and changes that made life less meaningful. The difference isn't about new versus old, or expensive versus affordable. The difference is about whether change serves the people who live in a place or serves the people who want to profit from that place. Martha's endorsement carried weight that transcended neighborhood politics because everyone knew her history of thoughtful community leadership. When she called my decision the kind of courage our community needs more of, it shifted the room's energy in ways that legal arguments and financial projections couldn't accomplish. Dr. Patricia Williams spoke next, providing academic perspective on community development that supported my position with research and historical examples. She explained how places like Bellwood Glen represented increasingly rare examples of organic growth and authentic character, how the loss of such places impoverished not just local communities, but the broader cultural landscape. But the moment that surprised me most came when Chad Everstone stood up to address the room. I'd expected criticism or legal challenges, but his actual remarks were something quite different. "I want to apologize to Mrs. Brighton and to this community," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "My wife and I came here thinking we understood what improvement meant, thinking that newer and more expensive was always better. Mrs. Brighton has taught us that improvement sometimes means protecting what's already valuable rather than replacing it with something more profitable." Chad's statement was brief, but significant because it represented acknowledgement from someone who'd initially opposed my position that the principles at stake transcended individual property disputes. His public support didn't erase the months of conflict, but it demonstrated that meaningful dialogue could change perspectives in ways that legal pressure couldn't accomplish. The meeting ended without formal votes or binding resolutions, but with something more important: community consensus that preservation of character was a legitimate use of legal authority, that economic pressure didn't automatically justify fundamental change, that communities had both the right and responsibility to protect what made them worth living in. As people filed out of the meeting room, I was approached by residents from other communities who faced similar development pressures. They wanted copies of my grandfather's covenant language, advice about establishing their own preservation frameworks, and encouragement that it was possible to stand up to well-funded developers without compromising community relationships. The drive home with Marta was quiet, both of us processing the significance of what had just occurred. We'd not only successfully defended the Covenant's authority, but had articulated principles that other communities could use to protect their own character against similar pressures. "You realize what you've accomplished tonight," Marta said as we pulled into my driveway. "You've shown that legal authority combined with moral clarity can overcome economic pressure and professional intimidation. That's not just a victory for Bellwood Glen, it's a model for how communities can protect themselves." That night, sitting in my study with the original Covenant documents spread before me, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from honoring obligations larger than personal convenience. My grandfather had given me legal tools to protect Bellwood Glen's character, but it had taken this conflict to teach me that those tools were only as powerful as the courage required to use them. Outside my window, the oak tree that Rebecca had wanted to remove stood silhouetted against the December sky, its bare branches creating patterns that would support new growth when spring returned. Like the tree, the community had weathered a storm that could have uprooted everything valuable, emerging stronger and more deeply rooted than before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to prove that preservation is not about resistance to change, but about ensuring that change serves community rather than commerce. But tonight, in the house where 3 generations of my family had learned the patience that comes from nurturing growth, I felt ready for whatever came next. The great preservation battle, as the newspaper had called it, was over, but the more important work of building authentic community had just begun. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that felt both natural and earned. By March, the first daffodils were pushing through soil that had been enriched by decades of careful composting, and I found myself planning the most ambitious garden expansion I'd attempted since Eli's death. The neighborhood had changed in ways that were both subtle and profound. The Everstones' former property now belonged to the Chen family, no relation to Sarah Chen, but a young couple with 2 children who'd been specifically attracted to Bellwood Glen's established character. Dr. Emily Chen was a pediatrician at the regional hospital, and her husband David taught environmental science at the community college. Their children, 6-year-old Lucy and 8-year-old Marcus, had quickly become regular visitors to my garden, fascinated by the way plants grew and changed through the seasons. Mrs. Brighton, Lucy asked one Saturday morning as we planted nasturtiums along the garden border, "Why do some flowers come back every year and some don't?" I explained the difference between annuals and perennials while thinking about the larger lesson embedded in her question. Some things in life require constant renewal and attention, while others develop deep enough roots to survive winter and return stronger each spring. Communities, I'd learned, were like perennial gardens. They required both careful tending and faith that the investment in deep roots would pay dividends over time. The collaborative approach to neighborhood maintenance that had emerged from our conflict with pinnacle development had evolved into something richer than any of us had originally envisioned. What had started as practical cooperation on projects like window restoration and garden maintenance had grown into genuine community in ways that surprised everyone involved. Sarah Chen, the other Sarah, who lived 3 houses down, had become the informal coordinator of our neighborhood resource sharing. Her background as a teacher made her naturally suited to organizing group learning projects, and her enthusiasm for old house maintenance had inspired others to see preservation work as adventure rather than burden. I never imagined I'd enjoy stripping paint from window frames, she told me one afternoon as we worked together on her kitchen windows. But there's something deeply satisfying about restoring these old details to their original beauty. The work groups that met every other Saturday had become social gatherings as much as practical cooperatives. We'd learn to repair plaster walls, restore hardwood floors, maintain old-growth landscaping, and update electrical systems while preserving architectural character. More importantly, we learned that the process of working together on shared challenges creates bonds that can't be achieved through casual interaction alone. Dr. Patricia Williams had spearheaded the historical preservation grant applications, and her research had uncovered funding sources none of us had known existed. By April, we'd received approval for 3 grants totaling nearly $40,000 to support restoration work on properties throughout Bellwood Glen. The grants required historical accuracy and community coordination, which meant our collaborative approach wasn't just philosophically satisfying, it was financially advantageous. Linda Kowalski had taken on the role of community historian, interviewing long-time residents and documenting the neighborhood's evolution over time. Her research had uncovered fascinating details about my grandfather's original development plan, including his intention to create what he called a demonstration of how modern convenience could coexist with natural beauty and community spirit. Your grandfather was remarkably prescient, Linda told me one evening as we reviewed her research materials. He understood that places either grow organically according to their own character, or they get developed according to external pressures that prioritize efficiency over authenticity. The most surprising development had been Rebecca Everstone's transformation from antagonist to enthusiastic participant in our preservation efforts. After the town hall meeting, she'd approached me with a proposal that I'd initially viewed with skepticism. "I realize I completely misunderstood what makes this place special," she'd said during a conversation in my kitchen that February. "But I still believe I have skills that could benefit the community if you're willing to help me understand how to use them constructively." Rebecca's background in lifestyle blogging, which I'd originally seen as superficial, turned out to be valuable in ways none of us had anticipated. She had expertise in photography, social media, and online community building that proved essential as a neighborhood story attracted attention from preservation organizations and other communities facing similar challenges. Her blog series about our collaborative restoration projects had been picked up by national publications focused on sustainable community development. And by spring we were receiving visitors from other towns who wanted to understand how a model might work in their own communities. The beautiful irony, Rebecca said during one of our planning meetings, is that the preservation approach is actually generating more positive attention and property value enhancement than the pinnacle development would have. We're just doing it in a way that builds community rather than destroys it. The visitors Rebecca's writing had attracted weren't developers or real estate speculators, but people who specifically appreciated the kind of authentic community character we'd been working to preserve. Property values had increased modestly but steadily, driven by demand from buyers who wanted what Bellwood Glen offered, rather than what they thought it could become. By May, my garden classes had expanded from 8 regular participants to more than 20, including several women who drove from neighbouring towns to participate in what had become known as the Bellwood Glen model of community-based preservation. The classes had evolved beyond basic gardening instruction to include workshops on heritage seed preservation, organic soil management, and the integration of food production with ornamental landscaping. The most meaningful development was the decision to establish a community garden on the 2-acre lot that had been vacant since the Henderson family moved to Florida. Instead of selling to a developer, the Hendersons had agreed to lease the property to a neighborhood association for community food production and educational programming. David Chen had designed the space according to permaculture principles that worked with natural water drainage and soil conditions. Dr. Williams had researched historical plant varieties that would have been grown in the area during my grandfather's era. Sarah Chen had organized educational programming that brought local school children to learn about sustainable agriculture and environmental stewardship. But the real success of the community garden wasn't measured in vegetables produced or children. It was measured in the way shared labor had created relationships that transcended the usual barriers of age, background, and length of residence. Working together on something that required both immediate effort and long-term vision had taught us things about each other that casual social interaction never revealed. I never expected that weeding beans could be so meditative, Martha Henley told me one morning as we worked side by side in the late spring sunshine. Or that planting next year's crops could feel like such an act of faith and hope. The annual Bellwood Glen Garden Tour, which had been a modest neighbourhood event for 15 years, attracted nearly 300 visitors that June. But instead of simply displaying individual properties, we'd organised the tour around the theme of community-based preservation, showcasing both restoration projects and collaborative initiatives that demonstrated alternatives to corporate development. The tour included stops at houses where residents explained their restoration techniques, the community garden where visitors could see sustainable food production in action, and my own property where I talked about the relationship between legal preservation frameworks and community stewardship. What people seem most interested in, I told Marta as we debriefed after the tour, isn't the specific projects we've completed, but the process we've developed for making decisions together about community character and growth. The tour's success had attracted attention from the State Historical Preservation Office, and by July we'd been invited to participate in a pilot program documenting innovative approaches to community-based historic preservation. The program would provide additional funding and technical support while creating resources that other communities could use to develop their own preservation strategies. As summer deepened into August, I found myself reflecting on the profound changes that had occurred since Rebecca Everstone first complained about my compost bins 15 months earlier. The conflict that had initially felt like a threat to my quiet way of life had ultimately created opportunities for community engagement that enriched rather than disrupted my daily routine. My Saturday garden classes had become the highlight of my week, providing opportunities to share knowledge while learning from women whose perspectives and experiences broadened my own understanding. The collaborative restoration projects had given me chances to use skills from my urban planning background in ways that felt more meaningful than any work I'd done during my professional career. Most importantly, the process of defending my grandfather's covenant had taught me that preservation isn't about resistance to change, it's about ensuring that change serves community rather than commerce. That growth builds on existing strengths rather than erasing them. That development enhances rather than replaces what makes places worth living in. The evening of the first anniversary of my confrontation with the Everstones, I sat on the porch swing where Eli had proposed 49 years earlier, watching the sunset filter through leaves of the oak tree that Rebecca had once wanted to remove. The tree looked exactly as it had a year ago, but my relationship to it and to the entire landscape of my life had been transformed by the events that had unfolded in its shade. Lucy Chen appeared at my garden gate, carrying a small bouquet of flowers she'd picked from her family's yard and arranged with the careful attention of someone who'd been learning about color and texture in our garden classes. "These are for you, Mrs. Brighton," she said, presenting the bouquet with the formality of someone making an important presentation. "My mom says you taught our neighborhood how to take care of itself." As I accepted the flowers and invited Lucy to sit with me on the swing, I thought about the legacy my grandfather had intended when he wrote the covenant that had started this entire adventure. He'd wanted to protect Bellwood Glen's character for future generations, but I suspected he'd also hoped that the process of protection would teach those generations something about the courage required to defend what matters. The flowers Lucy had brought me were a mixture of species, some cultivated, some wild, some traditional, some unusual, but arranged with an understanding of how different elements could work together to create beauty greater than the sum of individual parts. Like the community we'd built through our preservation efforts, the bouquet represented diversity within harmony, individual expression within shared purpose, growth that honored both tradition and innovation. "Mrs. Brighton," Lucy asked as we swayed gently on the swing, "will you teach me how to plant bulbs this fall so I can have flowers next spring?" "Of course," I said, thinking about the way some gifts pass from generation to generation through patient instruction and shared labor. "But first, let me tell you about the importance of choosing the right varieties for your specific soil and climate conditions." As we talked about the relationship between careful planning and future beauty, I realized that my grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the legal authority to protect our neighborhood, it had been the understanding that preservation requires both vision and community, both individual courage and collective commitment, both deep roots and faith in new growth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that communities are worth more than their property values, that authenticity is worth more than efficiency, that some things deserve protection, not because they're profitable, but because they're irreplaceable once lost. But tonight, in the garden where 3 generations of my family have learned the patience that comes from nurturing growth, I felt ready for whatever came next. The great preservation battle was over, but the more important work of building authentic community would continue for generations to come. And that, I thought as Lucy and I planned next spring's garden, was exactly as it should be. The first snow came late that December, soft and heavy, cloaking Bellwood Glen in silence and soft light. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the flurries gather along the garden paths, settling gently on the old oak trees' branches, each flake falling like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, transformative chapter. For the first time in many seasons, the stillness felt earned. We'd weathered something. Not just a development scheme or neighborhood squabble, but a challenge to our identity, our collective memory, and somehow we'd emerged with more than what we started with, stronger, more connected. It still astonished me. That winter, Bellwood Glen did what it had always done, rested. But this time, rest came not as retreat, but as quiet preparation. Beneath the snow, things were stirring: plans, soil, conversations. For me, it was a season of letters. I wrote to the Historical Society to thank them for their support and send along a detailed map of Bellwood Glen drawn originally by my grandfather, revised in my hand. I wrote to Jonah Linwood, who had just been appointed head of the town's new Preservation and Community Character Committee. I wrote to the Chans to congratulate them on the birth of their third child, a daughter named Iris, and included a packet of heirloom daffodil bulbs for spring. And I wrote to Eli. I still spoke to him often, but this was different. A letter, written in ink on paper from our wedding announcement stationery, folded into an envelope and sealed like it would be sent somewhere. I placed it in the drawer beside our bed, beneath the photograph of us on the porch swing in 1972. I kept it safe, I wrote. The land, the garden, the promise. And somehow, I found more than protection. I found purpose again. Come March, the snow receded. The earth sighed and opened. Crocuses slipped from their green sheaths like secrets finally shared. My boots sank deep into soft-on ground as I walked the perimeter of the Chan family's soon-to-be vegetable patch. Marcus and Lucy, their children, had named it the Little Eden. They wanted strawberries and snap peas, and David was planning to build a small root cellar beneath the old tool shed. They were stewards now. It wasn't just them. Something had shifted in the neighbourhood. The garden classes had become a rotating cooperative. Each month, a new host, a new garden, a new perspective. Martha Henley still led the class on roses, but it was Rebecca Everstone, yes, Rebecca who had taken over teaching composting and native pollinators. Her journey had been the most unexpected, perhaps, but also the most sincere. She didn't try to erase what had happened between us, she acknowledged it. Her past letters now lived in a sealed envelope tucked beneath our community bulletin. Board, labelled, A Record of Change, Gloria Simmons organised our first official Bellwood Glen story night, when neighbours gathered in the library's old reading room to share personal stories about their homes' renovations, ghosts, heartbreak. Joy, one man told of finding his father's dog tags beneath the loose floorboard. Another woman described how she'd nursed her partner through cancer in a sunroom built in 1948. No one spoke of square footage or resale value. Those nights, we didn't just preserve history, we made it. And me, I began writing again, not just letters, but essays, a full-length memoir, in fact, titled The Garden That Would Not Yield. It wasn't meant for publication, not at first, but Dr. Patricia Williams insisted on helping me submit it to an academic press. She called it a practical manifesto for place-based resistance. I called it a love letter to a way of life. We compromised by putting both on the back cover. The manuscript was accepted that June. I'll never forget the day the letter came. I was sitting beneath the apple tree, notebook in hand, scribbling revisions to a lesson plan for that week's class on companion planting. When I open the envelope and read the words, "We are thrilled to offer you a publication agreement," I cried, quietly, not from pride, but from a strange, deep reassurance that the fight we fought had meaning beyond our property lines. That perhaps others, too, might find in these pages the courage to say no, to protect the quiet things that mattered. By fall, the legacy of what we'd done was impossible to ignore. 3 more neighbourhoods in nearby towns contacted us for help creating their own protective covenants. Jonah had begun drafting a toolkit, part legal primer, part moral compass for communities facing similar development pressure, we called it the Bellwood Glen Blueprint. and it became the foundation for a regional preservation alliance that grew larger than any of us expected, even pinnacle development. After a particularly eloquent editorial in the county paper by Sarah Chen, issued a public statement recognizing the importance of sensitive community-led preservation efforts. It was lip service, sure, but a kind we'd never expected from them. We'd become inconveniently visible. The Everstones moved to Vermont in October. We sent them off with homemade granola and a basket of dried herbs from the garden. Rebecca hugged me tightly, and before she stepped into the moving van, she handed me a note. It read simply, "Thank you for showing me how to stay rooted, even when I didn't." That night, I made soup with the last of the season's leeks and sat on the porch swing as the wind moved through the drying hydrangeas. I could hear the distant river murmuring below. Somewhere in the dark, a barred owl called. I thought of Eli, of my grandfather, of all the hands that had planted seeds in this place. We had done it, not through confrontation alone, but cultivation. We till community from resistance. We turn legal structure into moral ground. We had shown clearly, unflinchingly, that not all growth means expansion. Some growth is deep, quiet, rooted. Like oak trees. The second annual Bellwood Autumn Fair brought over 700 guests. They came for the apple cider and wood-turning demonstrations, for the heirloom seed swap, for the community bake-off judged by the mayor. But mostly, they came to see something rare, a neighbourhood that had said no to homogenization and yes to each other. Martha Henley, in her last official act before moving to assisted living in Boston, was honoured with a garden archway at the entrance to the new community green space. A life lived in bloom. It read. Dr. Williams gave a lecture on the ethics of inheritance, tying our local fight to global questions about stewardship. Rebecca organised a children's scavenger hunt for native plant species, and I stood at a booth beneath a canvas awning signing copies of my book, each inscription ending with the words, "Let the roots remember." It was nearing dusk when I looked around and realised something that startled me in its simplicity. I was no longer just the old woman who'd saved her garden. I was part of a living legacy, a network of hands that protected, a chorus of voices that said, "This matters, this stays," and perhaps that, above all, was the lesson Bellwood Glen had taught me. That history isn't something behind us, it's what we choose to carry forward. That memory is an act. That beauty can be defended. That gardens and neighbourhoods can bloom not in spite of storms, but because of them. The oak tree still stands. Every morning, I greet it from the porch with a hand over my heart, a quiet ritual that began after the final vote against Pinnacle's appeal. Its roots, I imagine, hold echoes now not just of wind and water, but of every voice that said no. Of every step we took together toward yes, toward home, and so here we are, a year later. My name is Eleanor Brighton, Ellie to my friends, steward of Bellwood Glen, gardener of more than just soil dirt. And if you're reading this or hearing this, I hope it reminds you that sometimes the fiercest power comes not from confrontation, but from care, from choosing to plant something and stay. From believing that where we are is worth fighting for. From knowing that even the quietest voices, rooted deep enough, can hold the line and bloom again. Up next we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.